Hello.
Hey there.
So how are you doing today?
Good.
Good. I'm pretty excited about this Mix with the Masters thing.
They're really fun. I had my doubts about them before I started doing them, but they're really great. Just the sort of residential aspect of it is really nice because everybody's there all the time. So if you get into a conversation with somebody, you don't have to cut it off because you run out of time. You can always just continue it over dinner or after dinner in front of the fire or whatever.
Oh, great. So do the sessions last all day? Is it like you wake up like at...
Yeah, I mean, there is a schedule. Like you start in the morning and then there's a session that goes until a lunch break, and then there's another session that goes until a dinner break. And after the dinner break, if there's things to do or things to talk about, then you can continue doing stuff. Victor, the guy that runs it, wants to do video tutorial stuff. So he's going to be filming me doing tutorial stuff, very similar to the stuff in the seminar.
Okay.
So there'll be like a sort of a second chance to see demonstrations, and if you're around for the video shooting or whatever.
I see. So is this like the things that they've put up on their website with the other mixers that they have up there?
I don't know. I actually don't pay any attention to their website, so I don't know what's on there. I mean, I know I've done sort of Q&A type things
that
have been posted, but I think they have all the people that do seminars do that. But I think this is supposed to be more in depth.
Okay.
Like, okay, here's a certain technique for miking a drum kit, or here's a certain technique for miking amplifiers or whatever.
I see.
That's the impression I get. Anyway, I don't know.
Right. So
we'll see. I mean, each one of these things is kind of an experiment. So like they might try to do it and it might fall apart. And might not get enough usable material to make a video or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah. So is this like, will you be recording a band, like showing how to record like the mic techniques and we'll just go through a mix?
There's an English band called Rat the Magnificent who are coming, and they're going to be they'll be the guinea pigs for the session. So we'll do multi-track recording of that band. And we'll do multi-track recording using a couple of different techniques on the same band. Then we'll be doing individual instrument recordings, piano, acoustic guitar, and then doing it, mixing and editing all, on the tape machines in the analog domain.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I mostly work in the digital domain, but I assume most things translate over pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of sonic aspects of it do, but the thing that's probably most useful is if you wanted to conduct a session entirely in the analog domain, there aren't really that many places where you get to see or where you could learn like all of the relevant techniques. And the idea is that by the end of the seminar, you would learn not just like practical stuff that I do on a day-to-day basis in the studio, but you would learn all the fundamentals necessary for you to conduct future sessions entirely in the analog domain.
Great. Yeah. I mean, eventually I want to be able to work in both. I'd like to eventually open a studio, but it's kind of, you were saying in one of your videos, it's hard to do in this day and age.
Well, you essentially have to commit to doing it. I mean, once you've got your studio put together and once you've committed to the analog techniques as a way of doing things, the marginal cost is trivial. Like, the argument that you can't do analog sessions because tape is expensive just doesn't fly with me. Because I mean, I've seen bands spend more on a fucking fuzz box than you would spend on all of the tape for your album,
True.
So I think that's a specious argument. Like I've done records where, just a normal conventional independent band record where they spend a few $1,000s on the record, and then at the end of it, they have a big sushi night with the leftover money in the budget, and that night out on the town costs more than all the tape that they used for making the record. So I I understand the argument that building an entire analog studio is more expensive than having a laptop. That is a perfectly valid argument. But once you're in a studio and once the studio is functioning, there is no cost barrier to doing sessions in the analog domain. I know because I work with people who are broke as a fucking joke. You know,
right.
I make albums for what, a lot of bands would do singles for,
Right.
So the argument that the money is the reason not to do it is a specious argument. Money's it's a good excuse for people who just don't want to be bothered. That's fine. But it is, and it is more expensive to build an entire analog studio than it is to just have a laptop or whatever. But I have been conducting sessions entirely in the analog domain since, that meant renting a tape machine for $50 and borrowing some microphones. And so the cost barrier doesn't really seem like a real barrier to me. It's more of a conceptual leap that people are not willing to take.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Or plus you could do like me, and, I've been in this game for a long time, over 20 years. My first band recorded on analog tape, and then, we want to do a second session, and after the first album was done, mixed and everything, we just reused the same tape, which was probably a really bad idea archivally wise, but
Yeah, from an archival standpoint, it's a bad idea, but I know quite a few people who've done dumber things. So
right. Your band Shellac, you guys played actually in Iowa City, which is where I'm from, a few months ago. And
Gabe's, yeah.
Yeah, Gabe's.
Legendary Gabe's Oasis.
It is. There's been so many great bands that have played there. I wasn't even sure I was going to go to Mix with the Masters to begin with because money-wise.
Yeah, it's crazy expensive. I can't believe it does it.
Yeah.
From that standpoint. But, when you look at all of the other stuff that people are asked to spend money for, I feel like I do, I recognize that it's a big investment.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to make it worth everybody's while,
Yeah. And, I definitely think it's worth going. I also wanted to touch on, you're famous for using the harmonic percolator on your sound.
Right.
So I have 2 clones of this, and I cannot get that sound out of any of these clones. And I've seen you use a clone in a video, and you were not very happy with it. Is it just the original one that only works, or?
There is a duplicate. There are copies that are being made by, or that were being made by a guy named Collins, Dan Collins, something Collins. And I've seen those come into the studio, and those are, as near as I can tell, those are identical to my old ones. Now, having said that, I had several old ones. I think I had a total of 3 over the years, and all 3 of them sounded slightly different. Okay. So there were variations in sound. They use germanium parts, and germanium parts are temperature sensitive. So, like, it would sound different depending on the stage conditions. If it was getting hit by the lights, it would heat up and it would be thinner sounding. Like yeah. And then a lot of it is like a lot of the sort of overblown aspect of the percolator that might have to do with the setup, the particular amplifier setup that I have. Like I have a transistor amp and a tube amp running simultaneously, and the percolator into the transistor amp makes a very even, very squared off trebly sound. Into the tube amp, it tends to be more sort of low end. It tends to behave more like the tubes are being overdriven than that there's a fuzz. So, and the combination of those two is what makes the sustaining sound that I like.
I see.
There's an aspect of the percolator that where the guitar sort of plays itself. Like I always use it all the way open, like, both the sliders all the way at the top. And when I hit the button, I really don't have to do very much. The guitar just starts playing itself. Like there's microphonic feedback and and the sustaining string feedback, like all that stuff just goes kind of automatically no matter what I do. And that's one of the things that I like about it. And that doesn't seem to happen with other fuzz tones. I don't know why. I don't know why that particular aspect is so prominent in the percolator. Now, in the 80s, right after the Interfax dude that made the harmonic percolators, right after he died, a friend of mine made a copy of it. He just like drew a quick schematic of the circuit, and then he made a copy of it, not being careful about the parts or anything, just duplicating the circuit using whatever components he had laying around in his shop. And that sounds almost identical to the percolator that I had at the time.
Right.
You know, it's a very simple circuit, and it can't be that difficult to make it sound good. But a lot of people do get hung up on having, like, you know, special vintage era parts and stuff. I don't know that that's that significant.
Right. I mean, if I remember right, you know, seeing someone like tear open the original percolator, it was all gummed up anyway. It was hard to see. The
dude that made him was, because it's such a simple circuit, right? If it got popular, it would be very easy to be duplicated. So he hid all the components or sanded off the values of the components inside the percolators. So you'd have to discern the values by testing. That said, it's a dead simple circuit. So, and it's been published many times. So if you want to build one, you could probably build one. The one of the other, like, sort of odd aspects of my guitar setup is that in front of the harmonic percolator, I use a noise gate pedal. And the noise gate pedal acts as a buffer, and even when it's switched off, it's lowering the impedance of the guitar signal into the harmonic percolator. Mm-hmm. So that may have something to do with the way the harmonic percolator is behaving when it's fuzzing and when it's at the most extreme settings. I've never A-B'd the sound with and without the noise gate.
Sure.
But I would assume that it sounded slightly different just because the circuit would be reacting differently to the different source impedance.
Makes sense. I've done the same thing because I'll run a noise gate before fuzz and overdrive. It gives you a different tone for sure.
It's weird. Like, bands come into the studio all the time now with these, like, super elaborate pedal boards. You know, like, it's really uncommon to have somebody just plug into an amplifier anymore. Mm-hmm. Now, like, essentially every band shows up and everybody in the band has a pedal board that's got a bunch of different pedals on it.
Right.
I've only ever used just the one fuzz tone. So, and I use it for maybe 4% of the set, you know, something like that. Like a few moments of insult in the whole show I'm using the percolator. It does strike me as slightly odd that it has become that one pedal has become kind of a touchstone for a lot of people when it's hardly ever on.
Sure.
When I'm playing it.
Well, everybody's looking for something unique, and then by stealing other people's things, it's like, I don't know how they're going to get something unique, but.
Well, yeah, but I understand that. Like when I first started playing the Travis Bean guitars, like, I remembered that Keith Levine from Public Image played a Travis Bean when I saw them, and that intrigued me. And it was like, I always liked his guitar playing, and I thought I thought it was cool. So when a Travis Bean became available, I immediately tried to buy it so I could play around with it, you know. And then it turns out I liked it, you know. Sure. But it started with me remembering that a guitar player that I liked was using a certain kind of guitar, and then I wanted to try it as well because I had a Mosrite guitar because I was a big Ramones fan, and Johnny Ramone always played a Mosrite, you know. Mm-hmm. So and it turned out that for the way I was just learning how to play guitar at the time, and for my limited skill set, the Mosrite was more guitar than I could handle. And so it sounded bad when I played it. It sounded great when Johnny Ramone played it. It sounded bad when I played it. So eventually I got rid of that guitar. But I think that's a perfectly normal thing when you're, you know, trying to invigorate or reinvigorate your sound. If there's something that somebody else uses and you like the way it works for that person, there's no reason, there's no reason not to take a stab at it yourself and see if you get results that you like as well. I think that's perfectly normal.
Sure. Plus, all art is, an amalgamation of all your influences put together, so makes sense.
I feel less definite about that from a musician standpoint or an artistic standpoint than I do about like the technical task of being a recording engineer. Mm-hmm. Because everything that I do in the studio, like everything that I've learned how to do in the studio, somebody else showed me how to do it, or I asked somebody and they showed me how to do it. I learned it from somebody else. So it's all existing prior art. It's all existing practices that I learned how to do rather than stuff that I invented on my own,
So you haven't done much trial and error in the studio, or is it?
Oh, no. You're running experiments constantly. Like every session is an opportunity to learn more about how to do it, right?
Sure.
But when I've been in a conundrum about something, often it's because it's a brand new problem, and if that brand new problem persists, I'll often go back to the literature, or I'll ask some other engineer, or I'll talk, read up about that problem and then discover the way it was solved by other people and then try to apply that for myself. Like one of the things that I do regularly in like acoustic music recording or recording a drum kit or something like that, anything where the acoustic sound in the room is an important part of the experience of the music, right? I'll always put up a room mic. I'll always have a room mic in the room to capture the room sound, so that you can hear the reflected energy of the room as a contributing part of the sound, right? I almost always use an omnidirectional microphone on the floor. And I do that because I read about the boundary principle, the boundary effect, where you get a clearer sound if a microphone is next to a boundary because you have fewer near field reflections into that microphone because it's on a boundary. I didn't invent that as a technique. I learned that, Another thing that I'll do is I'll often use a delay line on that ambient microphone to delay that ambient microphone by a few milliseconds. And what that does is it moves the sound, reflected sound in that microphone. It moves it far enough away in time from the initial onset of the sound that it's perceived as a reflection or as an echo or as an ambient sound, rather than just being a slightly out of phase signal summing with the close mic sound. And that region, the region where it's perceived as an out of phase or a misaligned signal, is a relatively short period of time, like up to about 30 milliseconds. Your brain has a hard time perceiving those two sounds as separate. But so if you move the ambient signal in time so that the ambient signal is a little bit farther away from the initial onset signal, then it's much easier for your brain to resolve it as an ambient signal. And that's called the Haas effect, HAAS. And I learned about that after I was shown the technique for doing that by another engineer, a guy named Sam Fishkin, at a studio called Studio Media. When I was in my 20s, I was doing a recording session for a band, and I had a room mic, and he on the floor, because I'd read about the boundary effect, and he said, "Have you ever tried delaying the room mics?" And I said, "No, what does that do?" And he said, "I don't know what it does really, but it sounds better." So I tried delaying the room mics by a few milliseconds, and it did sound better. It was instantly clearer, and the ambient sound had more impact, and everything about it sounded better. So then I started reading about why would a perceived delay in an ambient sound, not using an echo on an original source sound, but using a delay on an ambient capture of a sound relative to a close mic on the sound. I started trying to find literature about that, and that's when I started. The Haas effect was described in like the 17th, 18th century, or the 18th century. So, I mean, that's how old all of these things are. These principles are all very old. A lot of them they're all established acoustic principles and electronic techniques and studio practices. They're all of them are old. But if you don't know them, when you discover it, it's like a brand new piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
So like, I feel like I learned everything that I know how to do from other people that already knew how to do it. So it's, it's kind of incumbent on me to share that information with other people because it's part of the oral tradition of learning in the profession.
Yeah, makes sense. I had another question about your drum mic techniques. So this kind of leads into that, I suppose. I noticed like on albums like In Utero, a lot of the drum sound seems to come from the actual room mics, and you're relying a lot less on the close mics.
The close mics are really important because they give definition to the sound and allows you to control the balance. So, you can get, if the floor tom isn't loud enough, you can make the floor tom loud or whatever. Right. So the close mics are critical. The room sound is sort of is a character element, So if you want the drums to be like a more stylistic element, or you want the drums to be like one of the more like a defining element of a passage, then the room sound is a good way to do that, because the room sound is going to vary a lot from room to room, and so you get you can get a more complete picture of what the drums actually sound like in the room that they were playing in. Sure. In some instances, you want the drums to be like a background element. You just want them to be keeping time, and the rest of the band is more important.
Right.
If the drums as an instrument are not featured, it's a fool's errand trying to make the drums sound special when the drums are not a special part of the music.
Makes sense. Feature what's supposed to be featured.
Yeah.
Would you say? I mean, do you use like gates and things on your drums, or do you try to keep them all natural?
Gates very rarely, and for very specific purposes. Once in a while, I'll give you an example. Like there's a technique that I use a lot where there'll be a conventional bass drum microphone in front of the bass drum, or slightly inside the bass drum, and then I'll have another much brighter microphone on the batter side of the bass drum, pointing at the contact area of the beater and the drum head. So that's a very specific utilitarian purpose, that microphone. It's picking up the contact sound of the beater hitting the bass drum head. Mm-hmm. It's not meant to be a full spectrum sound. It's not meant to be the sound of the bass drum. It's a functional sound that I will be using to add definition to the other conventional bass drum microphone, which is sort of doing the bulk of the work.
Yeah, you're just getting the click out of it, or whatever you want.
Yeah, the impact sound. I mean, it's actually more useful on bass drums that have a softer attack. So, like if the guy's using one of those big fluffy beaters, or if he's using a felt beater, and the bass drum itself doesn't have a ton of attack, then that microphone that's right by the contact point actually is more useful than if it's a clicky bass drum where it's a wood beater or a hard plastic beater hitting one of those impact pads or whatever. Like that has a ton of attack already. So the conventional bass drum microphone might sound fine as is. Mm-hmm. But if the bass drum has a soft attack, it's difficult to add definition to the bass drum and retain the sort of normal thumpy quality that the drummer is obviously shooting for when he's using a soft beater, right? So that batter side microphone helps a lot in that situation because it adds the precise moment of impact, like it adds that soft transient to what is otherwise a very pillowy sound, very rubbery, pillowy sound.
Sure.
So, but in any case, So you have that special purpose microphone in that one spot. Now, that spot physically is also underneath the rack tom and underneath the snare drum. So it's picking up a ton of chatter from the whole rest of the drum kit. And I will often use a ducker on that microphone so that when the guy twats the snare drum, it attenuates that microphone and you don't hear a ton of snare drum flap in that microphone. And I'll often use an expander or a gate on that microphone so that it's not picking up a bunch of rumble from the other instruments and a bunch of cymbal hash, but it's only opening when that bass drum beater hits right next to it,
Makes sense.
Now, if you solo that microphone up in that state where it's being shut down all the time, if you solo, just listen to that microphone, just, hit the PFL on that channel and listen to that microphone, it sounds fucking absurd. It's if somebody said, yeah, this is what I want to do to your bass drum, any drummer would want to strangle him, right? But as a utilitarian thing to bolster or add definition to the conventional bass drum sound, it's very useful. So you're not using that as the bass drum sound. You're using that as a component part of a simulacrum of the bass drum sound in reality you're trying to evoke a realistic or a naturalistic presentation of the bass drum. And that this odd, unusual sound, I've found, can help with that presentation, helps make the bass drum sound more normal, more natural, if you add that component back into it. So there's an example of a situation where I would use a gate on a drum, but not for the purpose of gating out sounds around a strike of a drum, but just because I'm creating a very specific utilitarian signal to add to the more conventional bass drum microphone. So that's how I tend to use things like compressors and gates and duckers and equalizers. Not for the purpose of altering the sound of the instrument that I'm listening to, but to solve a specific problem or to make a utilitarian adjustment to something that is, almost good enough as is,
Sure.
So like compressors are another good example. A lot of people sort of pro forma put compressors on essentially every signal they record. I'm very aware of the sound of a compressor working. Like when I hear someone's voice go up in dynamic, and then I hear the sound of the compressor constraining that person's voice, it's uncomfortable on my ear. It sounds phony. It sounds like something has happened that has sort of taken me out of the moment of listening to the singer sing, and it's made me concentrate on this fucking gimmick that the engineer did, right? So I tend not to use aggressive compression, and I tend to use compressors for very specific purposes, where the trade-off between compromising the sound and the technical problems that result from the wide dynamic range, where I can manage that trade-off to a point where neither one is offensive. You don't lose the signal into the noise for the dynamic range being too wide, but you also don't hear the artifacts of the compressor choking the signal off.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm most excited to learn from you is I rely way heavily on compression and things like that. So to learn a whole other aspect is just probably the most exciting thing about this. Do you mind if I move on to a different topic here? Just
it's your circus, man.
All right, I appreciate it. How did you start out recording? Like I started out with 2 boom boxes, going back and forth, and then moved on to 4-track and DATs and all sorts of things, and just finally into the digital world. What did you start with, and what was your progression?
Well, I was in a band in 1978, 79, that sort of era, and we wanted to make a recording of ourselves. And there was a guitar shop in my hometown. I grew up in Missoula, Montana, and there was a guitar shop in town that had a 4-track Tascam that they would rent out to people to do demo recordings of themselves. They would rent the 4-track and some microphones and some microphone cables, and then you could take that to your practice space and do a demo recording.
Cool.
And so we did that a couple of weekends in a row. We rented this 4-track and just fucked around with it in my friend John Rose's basement and recorded the songs that we had come up with. And that sort of got me interested in tinkering with the tape machine as a device. And I started experimenting with it. And then when I moved to Chicago in the summer of 1980, and I got involved in the music scene here. And because I had some experience doing recordings, I made myself available to my friends' bands, to the bands I was in and my friends' bands, to do recordings. And typically I would do what I had done in Montana. I would go to a music shop and rent a reel-to-reel 4-track, and then just do demo recordings that way. And I did that for a couple of years, and then I started accompanying bands into the studio. It was during the punk era. There were a lot of small, like, demo studios and jingle studios and stuff that would advertise in the music in the papers that were geared toward local music, like the weekly entertainment papers that would show listings of all the bands and have ads for where to get a PA and rehearsal spaces and recording studios and all that kind of stuff. So I started. Bands would go into the studio not really having any kind of a reputation or anything, but just like being a local studio that they could afford.
Sure.
So they would go into those studios, and often they would have a very hard time with the house engineer, because I was in a punk band, all my friends were in punk bands, and we wanted to make ugly music. And then you'd go into a studio where the guy's ambition in life is to make music that sounds like fucking Steely Dan or whatever, Right. And so just communicating your ideas was difficult. And in a lot of cases, a lot of bands would be very unhappy with the results from these small studios because the engineer would be kind of bulldozing the session and trying to shoehorn them into his conception of music, don't play that ratty drum kit that you brought in. You should play our house drum kit. Our house drum kit is tuned perfectly, things like that.
Yeah.
Or, your amplifier is way too loud. You're distorting the microphones, and I can't make a good recording this way. So you have to turn your guitar amp down, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of bands suffered that kind of interference
in there.
And it soured them on the experience of recording. So, that's informed, ever since then, that's informed my conception of my job as an engineer. I try very hard not to be the guy that prevents the band from doing what they normally do. And in the 1980s, so I would often accompany my friends' bands into the studio and act as a kind of a translator for the engineer. Like, the bass player would have his broken, fuzzy sounding bass, and this guy had probably never heard a bass guitar with distortion on it before.
Mm-hmm. So
he would say, "Is that amp broken or fucked up?" No, that's the way it sounds. He likes it that way. So I was a kind of a buffer between the bands and the engineer, the house engineer. And then eventually I developed enough facility that in those situations that I ended up just deciding to try engineering myself. And so then I at first with assistants and then eventually on my own, I was engineering these sessions for my friends' bands. And then I started that, like I made a record for my band that I'd recorded myself. And then carried on working on my own band's music in parallel with working as an engineer for other bands that were in my peer group. And over time, that just developed into me building a studio in the basement of my house, and then it becoming a sort of a functioning studio for hire. And then I had enough work that I could quit my job, and then I quit my job and I was an engineer full time. And then I saved a bunch of money and I bought a building and went broke a bunch of times and built the studio that you see behind me. And I've been here for 20 years now.
Great. Yeah, it's a great story. I can relate to a lot of it up until the point of building my own electrical audio. But
when you get to the part where you're $1 million in the hole, that'll wake you up in a hurry.
I'm on my way. Yeah, I was going to ask if you ever butt heads with artists and stuff like that, because I always find it's better to just let them do their thing. You get a better performance out of them and stuff like that.
I try never to interfere with what a band is going through in the studio. I try to let them have the experience of making the record that they wanted to make.
Yeah.
My tastes don't really enter into it. More than a few times I've heard something and thought that it was wrong or a mistake. And when I draw the band's attention to it, they're like, oh, no, it goes that way. That's how it sounds.
Okay.
So fair game, that's what a concept I refer to as listener error. When I hear something and I don't get it and I think it's wrong, but that's exactly what was intended, or if that's a natural, a normal part of the music, then the fault was mine. It was listener error. It wasn't something that the band did wrong. And I feel like the more restraint I can display in the studio in terms of directing the behavior of the band and the music, the more likely it is that the record at the end of it all, that it's more likely then that the record will reflect the band. And if the band is going to have a relationship with their audience, the least that they should be able to expect is to have it be a genuine experience, like a genuine expression of what they're trying to do, and not, that filtered through me and my preconceptions.
Right. Well, that being said, don't you ever have bands you record with them and then they're like, okay, go ahead and mix it and we're just going to leave, and then you do your thing mixing it? Or do you always work with the band one-on-one?
Really, really, really rare. I'll give you an example. I did a session a couple of years ago with a band called Bellini, and the various members of the band live in different countries. Mm-hmm. They got together for a tour, and at the end of the tour, they recorded an album, but they didn't have enough time or money to finish the album. So they recorded 12 songs. Let's say 6 of them had vocals finished. One of them was an instrumental, but the other 5, the singer had to record the vocals on those songs by herself, over the course of the intervening period. And then when that was finished, they sent me the vocal recordings, and I transferred them to the master tape. So now I have a finished, completed master tape of an album with no reference for mixing it, and it's now a year and a half later. So I have to mix or do an attempt at mixing the band. And I'm familiar with the band, and all the songs are of the same format, one guitar, one bass, drum kit, one vocal. Mm-hmm. So I'm familiar with the band. I've done other records with them. I understand their aesthetic. So I take a first stab at mixing it, and I send them all of these mixes, and then they send me commentary on them, and then I make adjustments, and then I send them out again, and they send me, it's a really circuitous process, an iterative process, takes forever, and it's a total fucking drag, and I don't like doing it. I do maybe one session a year like that.
I see.
The rest of the time, the band is sitting right next to me, telling me moment by moment what they like and don't like. And that's by far the best way to do it. By far. Like no other way comes close. Because if I get off on a nerdy tangent and I'm up my own asshole about the bass drum or something, or like I'm trying to like create the magic sound with the echo or something like that.
Yeah.
Like I could spend time and energy on that. And it turns out the band is not into it.
Mm-hmm.
I've wasted all that time and energy. And in a lot of cases, like especially when I was more inexperienced, I might have some emotional investment in having done a good job on this little element of the sound that I was really tweaked about, right? So I wouldn't want to give it up. It would be like a little darling for me, right? I've trained myself to just abandon all of that. So like if I'm working on some nerdy thing and the band is not into it, they don't like the effect of it, I should and I do now instantly abandon that and not pursue it. And that allows us to get to an end point where everyone is really into the results much, much faster. Whereas, the iterative process of me sending off rough mixes and then they send me comments about the rough mixes and then I do an attempt at a final mix and then they send me adjustments on the final mix and then I send them the new final mix and then they give me minor adjustments and I send them the new minor thing. That takes forever. Total fucking drag, real tedious, and I don't recommend it.
Yeah. That's one of the things I mainly do is remote mixing and stuff. And it, eventually that's why I do want to open the studio and be able to work that way.
Yeah. If that was my job, if that's what I had to do for a living, I would fucking quit.
Right.
I would rather shovel shit than have that be the work routine. It's so, for me anyway, it's so alien to be fucking with somebody else's music and they're not even in the room. Like that's just really it's too distant of an abstraction for me. I really do rely on the people who made the record being in the room with me, telling me what they like and don't like.
It makes sense.
Really rely on that.
It does make sense. I mean, there's a certain amount of trust that they put in you when they're sending it back and forth and whatnot.
My persistent dread is that somebody's record will come out and they will have reservations about it, and those reservations will be my fault.
Right.
And I can avoid that by having the band here telling me what they like and don't like, and at every turn, me facilitating their tastes and their, their expectations and their aesthetic.
Sure.
Like I'm perfectly comfortable doing that. Like I have really good technical mastery of my equipment. What I don't have is a brilliant creative vision, right? The band is responsible for the brilliant creative vision. But I flatter myself that I'm very good at helping them execute it, So I feel like it's critically important for me for the band to be calling the shots in the studio, especially at the mixdown phase when everything is finished, where you're about to like send it off to history. Right. That's a really critical point for me.
Yeah, and I can see your point. I agree with it. All right. So one more question. We'll finish this up. It's been a long one. I appreciate you doing this.
No problem.
Thank you so much. Talking about mix with the masters, who do you consider a master? And like, if they had a program like this, who would you like to go work with?
Well, the people that I learned from, that behaved as mentors to me, were fantastic in the studio. There's a guy named John Loader, an English guy who ran Southern Studios and Southern Records. He made a bunch of amazing sounding punk records in the 70s and 80s. He ran a small studio that was a model of efficiency. It was in a physically small space, very high quality. He got great results for every band that he worked with. I really admired him tremendously, and he was an enormous help to me. I got to see him at work, and I got to see him interact with people and be, just have a mastery and a grasp of his equipment, and that was inspirational for me. The other guy that was really inspirational for me was a guy named Ian Burgess, who's another Englishman, but he lived in Chicago, and he worked with all of the punk bands back in the day, and his attitude toward the bands and toward their behavior was inspirational to me. Like if somebody in a band had a goofy idea about something, a lot of engineers would start thinking about why they shouldn't do it. You know, like, oh, I want to put my Fender Twin in an aquarium, and then I want to fill the aquarium with marbles, and I want to slowly pour Wesson cooking oil over the amplifier while it's playing. You know, like a lot of engineers would be like, I don't want to do that. That's going to be messy and a drag, and it'll take forever. Like Ian's first impulse was to go buy a fucking aquarium and get started on it. You know, like he was a really inspirational guy in terms of his, like, he trusted the bands to have an aesthetic and to have their mania, like, under productive circumstances. So whatever the band wanted to try, he wanted to try it as well, right? Both those guys are dead, but they were inspirational to me. If I had to pick somebody that I had never seen work, it's oddly enough, it's a guy that has actually done a mix with the master session. Al Schmidt has been a fantastic engineer for like 50 fucking years. Yeah. You know, and you can't pin his engineering to a particular era or style of music or even a particular aesthetic, right?
Sure.
But over a very long arc of a career, he's worked with people on fantastic sounding records of every type at all points in their careers as well, you know? Mm-hmm. So he's a really terrific example of an engineer doesn't try to make a name for himself. Like your average music fan doesn't know who Al Schmidt is, but Al Schmidt has worked on so many of the records that you listen to and you're just stunned by the sound of them.
And he's very much about that natural sound as well. You know, just the things I've seen from his mix with the masters and such, he just goes for the sound of what he's trying to capture.
What impresses me most about him is his durability, that he was able to make records in the sort of, you know, suit and tie lab coat era of the 50s and early 60s, the pop music sort of, you know, the sort of manufactured pop music era. And then he made records with psychedelic bands. And then he made records with, you know, hard rock bands and all the jazz and fusion spin-offs, and then like lounge piano music and big band stuff. Like he's made essentially every kind of record over a very long career, and it's just his durability is incredible.
Sure. Yeah, I agree.
And it doesn't, you know, it's not misstating it if I say like I aspire to that level of durability. Like I would love to still be making records in another 30 years, you know. That would be fucking awesome. If my hearing can hold out and if my skill set doesn't deteriorate too much more, if I could still be doing it in my late 70s and the way Al Schmidt is, I would consider that an accomplishment.
Great. I hope you are. I hope you're still doing it then. So, all right. Well, I guess that's about it. Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate all this time. I mean, I think we talked for about an hour, so thank you so much. And
no problem.